Hey, welcome to part 2 of How Do You Build an App. This is the second in a double header about the kind of core parts, that cycle that I talked about in my previous episode. Please go back and watch that if you haven't seen it already. When I originally recorded or thought about compiling this material, I was like trying to put all this into one episode, but it just got so big. And it's really the core of this entire series. So please go back, grab that episode if you haven't seen it already. In this one, I'm going to be talking a lot more about the kind of stuff that I used to do as an engineer. But I'm going to try to get to the guts of it without going too deep in the weeds of technical stuff. However, if you are an engineer and you're listening to this, please take a seat because I have some important takeaways for what it means if you're actually getting involved and rolling up your sleeves to do the coding of the app yourself. So, in the previous episode, I talked about two particular roles of folks that are core to that team. And I purposely started off with them, right? I talked about the user experience designer and I talked about the product owner. Now, those are the folks who are working tightly together to come up with the concepts of the screens that are going to go into the app. What are the actual paying customers going to do when they interact with the app? And the UX designer especially is specifying in great detail exactly what screens and buttons and all of the actual processes go into somebody's journey as they engage with the app as a customer. And it's going to spark them to be really fulfilled with achieving the goal that they had. They're going to be delighted. We talk about a delighter in the mobile app development game. And because of that delight, that's what's going to cause them to subscribe or do whatever other actions are going to provide that payoff so that you actually get revenue from the app. So those two roles are absolutely critical. And often I've seen folks, when I was working in co-work spaces, they just want to, I'm going to cut to the chase. I don't need any of the stuff. I'm just going to jump right in and start coding, building the app. Don't need these expensive UX designers. They're just going to be there to make things pretty. They are not. Their role is absolutely essential. And as an engineer, once I learned what happens when projects die, when projects crash, and I covered those two scenarios in the previous talk, I realized that unless you have that UX designer, unless you have that product owner working to determine what those features actually look like, it doesn't matter if you have the best engineers in the world, the product will fail. All right, so let's assume they're on board. Who else have we got? Who else is lining up to deliver this out? Well, I want to talk about the engineering manager. Now, on a big project, you would have somebody who is looking after all the different teams. There might be several teams involved in the app. For example, you might have a group of folks working mostly on the back end, building the infrastructure that is going to serve up the persistent behavior of the app over time. I engage with the app, I press some buttons, do something, off it goes to the back end, it's saved there, and then the next time I pull out my phone, you know what, that data that I interacted with, it's still there because it's been persisted into some sort of back end layer. It might be that you can persist it right there on the device, in which case you've got back end folks that are back end on the front end, and they are still less involved with actually creating buttons and so on. But you might have these different teams. So you would have a team lead in charge of each one, and you have an engineering manager. If you've got a very small project and you've only got very limited amount of screens or functionality, It could be that you've just got a team lead. Now, this could be someone who is basically kind of coaching the team along. They could potentially write some code, but one of their main functions is to basically anchor the technical progress of the app. And typically, as soon as you've got more than 2 or 3 developers, you've got a team lead who's full-time kind of making sure that releases happen, checking on code to make sure the quality is there, ensuring that continuous integration systems, they are automated robots that are just going to work in the background to ensure that we have the least amount of repetitive labor going on to actually ship those releases out the door. That team lead is going to be full-time getting all of that stuff working. And this is especially the case if you've got any kind of outsourcing going on. One pattern that I used to see a fair amount, especially in consulting, would be that you'd have an onshore project manager, coach, engineering manager, somebody who was very clueful with respect to the domain of what you're building. So, for example, if you're building a fintech app, you might get a technical lead or technical project manager who is very familiar with the fintech side of things, and they might manage a number of developers who are not located in your time zone. Again, big problem I used to see would be somebody trying to build an app that jump on some kind of outsourcing platform. Nothing wrong with those platforms. Nothing wrong with the developers on those platforms. But if you don't know how to manage a team, if you don't know how to integrate their code, if you don't know how to run iterations, if you don't know how to check that code is being pushed in small batches into your code repository, maybe you don't even know what a code repository is, then you should not be doing this without that project manager there running that remotely located team. Now, the team lead, the project manager, or the engineering manager in ascending levels of how many of a hierarchy they are managing, they have an important role in knitting the team together as well. So that engineering manager, they would be meeting and working a lot with the product owner. So you've got the progress of the business side where you've got that product owner who's looking at the features, and that product owner will be getting their phone out regularly every week, maybe even more frequently than that, every day, to check that the features that they've prioritized are actually working on those latest builds. And then they're checking in with the engineering manager who is doing the technical side of that. So that engineering manager would be looking at the new feature work that's dropping, stuff that's going into the repository and then getting built into our frequent releases. And the two of them are working together to just say, hey, you know what, I thought the login box was working. And then the engineering manager comes back and said, oh, well, it's working. You know what, we've done the UX side of it, but we've dummied out the back end just for now so you can interact with it, but it's not going to actually lock whatever it happens to be. So they can have that dialogue about where things are at. So we can also get a dialogue going about quality issues, what kind of tolerance we've got for moving fast versus fixing things up later. All these kinds of conversations will be happening between the product owner and the engineering manager. There's also going to be a dialogue around resourcing. So typically the product owner would be the person with the purse strings. They would have a good handle on what the backers of the project, the investors, be they startup investors, seed capital, maybe an accelerator, maybe it's mom and pop, whatever those expectations are that are coming in, Maybe you've got an app where you've got on board some early customers. That's fantastic. That's exactly what should be happening. Those early customers might have bought in some way. Maybe they've bought an early premium membership or subscription. Talking to those folks is the job of the product owner, to find out exactly what it is that they're looking for, and to be working with the engineering manager to provide them with the resources. So that could be clock cycles on a continuous integration system that needs to be running, on infrastructure, that the early infrastructure where they're deploying, etc., etc. So you've got all those high volume interactions happening between those business side folks and those engineering lead folks. So from there, we've basically sort of come to this summary, if you like. We've got this structure that I'm going to be talking more and more about in this particular talk. But you can think about it as the product owner is overseeing the business side, whereas the project manager or engineering manager is overseeing the technical progress. So how do they do that? How does this happen? Well, typically we've got this cycle, this rhythm. And previously I've talked about this necessity for the team to have its dynamic engagement with the program of work that you are trying to get completed. And it's very important. You cannot afford to burn the team. You can recover from anything as long as this flywheel is still spinning. And basically the way you would sort of work this would be that your product owners would get together with your engineering manager, and they would look at what kinds of work they can do in the next 2 weeks, for argument's sake. And from that, they would generate very tightly described requirements, typically in the form of something on a collaborative platform, for example, Trello, or basically anything that's got the concept of backlog, doing and done. Do not try to use email for this. I also don't recommend, some other sorts of platforms, like some folks are using ClickUp or something these days, but be very careful to make sure that there is some way to represent a unit of work and looking at when that work is meant to be done. So you've got a sort of a due date on it. And then once that work is finished, you've got some way of marking that by dragging it to a done column. I suggest, if you haven't used anything else, just start with Trello. You can create a new board for every week. You can have a single board and just clean all the cards out of it. That works as well. But this is going to be your cycle. Your engineering manager, your project manager, and your product owner, they're going to have got together and had a meeting, probably a 2 to 4 hour meeting, where they work through what is the top priority features. And this, if you saw my tie-in series where I talked about going off course, I had the picture of the boat navigating the feature C. This is where they're identifying that constantly changing direction to make sure that they're homing in on the priority items that are going to lead you directly to that customer money. So having identified those in the planning workshop, it may be that the engineering manager will need to pull in some of the team to get some advice about some particular feature. So maybe you've got somebody who's working on, say, the login, or somebody who's working on the chat interface, or whatever it happens to be. You might pull that person in and just say, hang on, how big is this thing going to be? Like, are we going to be able to get it done in a sprint, or do we need to divide it up? Now, you might have heard about story points and all of this kind of thing. I do not recommend using story points. The best approach really is just to make all of your cards as small as possible, but no smaller. Your goal is to have very, very small, discrete pieces of work. And the ideal would be that an engineer could get 2 or 3 of these done every sprint. Now, folks have to go to the dentist, right? Some people who are very good engineers only work part-time, so they might only be available for some limited period out of that 2 weeks. Don't start talking about these items that you're producing in that planning workshop as though they were days. Never, ever, ever do that. Like, seriously, if you are thinking about how many days is this going to get done, like, stop watching this series right now, because you cannot work like that. Seriously, I am not joking. You can't ask an engineer, like, oh, how many days to build a login box or whatever. They might have a crack at guessing what that is, but the start of the problem is you don't even know what your login thing is going to look like. I talked in previous lectures about there's a million different ways to do a login box. So the goal of this is not to assign dates to things. The goal of this is simply to create a queue of work. That's it. The work should be about the same size and very small. Create simple features. So for a login, for example, you might have one feature which is just to put the frame of the login box on the screen. Another one is going to be populate the text fields along with some verification to make sure that you can't paste wacky characters into that. So that's called validation. So card number 1, just the raw creation. Card number 2, validation. Card number 3, maybe some animation to bring it onto the screen at some particular time and then remove it from the screen. That's those segues or reveals could be a card in themselves. You might have some back-end cards that are going to wire it up to some local database and store a token. There could be 6 or 7 very small cards just to do something as basic as the first part of a login screen. So that's the granularity that you want to do. Now, what's going to allow this to happen from this process is that you'll get something way better than an estimate of days. Right? I'll repeat that. You will have the power that is way better than days. And what is that power? The power is, it's like a crystal ball. If you keep your team together and don't burn your team, and you have the same team working in this virtuous cycle, after a while, you'll be able to see exactly how many of these cards they get through every sprint. And then by the end of the sprint, you start at the beginning of 2 weeks, you produce this backlog of work. The end of the 2 weeks, you get a meeting together, you have all your engineers together as well, and you sit around for about 45 minutes and you just brainstorm all of the problems that you discovered during the sprint. What went wrong? What could have gone better? What was great? What was awesome? Celebrate some wins. And generally that meeting will be called a retro. We'll also be looking at, towards the end of the sprint, we'll have the engineering manager and the product owner who will be going through and just looking to see which of those feature cards actually got completed properly. I have a build and, oh yeah, that works. I can open the login box. Maybe it's not doing the validation yet. I can type something in, but I can put anything in there, spaces, what have you. So, you might get some cards finished, other cards not, and then they can be moved into the planning workshop. So when you get a card that is not finished, it goes around back into the planning workshop and you can examine it for priority and look at if it's going to be put into the next sprint. It doesn't automatically go in there. It's always a process of decision making guided by the product owner. Now, your priorities could change, right? The product owner could say, oh my gosh, my chief competitor is going to a model where they allow anonymous users, and we try to do an incremental login. So you know what? I'm deprioritizing the login box. That can happen much, much later. So therefore, they might take that item out And then the engineering manager and the product owner will communicate to the team and say, hey, look, guys, great work on the login box. We're going to be doing that one a bit further down the track. It's not scrapped, it's not wasted. That work was really awesome. We're not going to be using that in the next release. It will come in June, July, August, whenever it happens to be. Now we need you to work on whatever else. So you're keeping the team together, you're keeping that velocity going, but you're also working ideally on the most important features. Now, engineers are coming and going. This is something that always happens. If you've got, so there's something I call the rule of four, Sarah's rule of four. If you've got 4 engineers working on your project, one of them will be having a hard time. I don't like to use the word failing, but they will definitely be not meeting your criteria for success at any given time. And it could be because they've got family stuff going on. It could be because of health reasons. It could be that they're struggling to understand the actual project. You know, maybe their expertise lies in some area that doesn't align with the work they're doing at this particular time. Whatever it happens to be, that struggle is one that the engineering manager or the project manager has to resolve with that member. Now, I prefer to try to make the best of the team that I have, because it's very expensive to fire people, get rid of them. Very often the problem is not that engineer. Very often the problem is your communication. And I've got a completely separate presentation that I'll do about this later. But team dynamics is really, really hard. And your first order approximation for understanding why a team member is underperforming should be, is it me as the engineering manager? What is wrong with my communication strategy? Am I listening enough? Am I communicating what the mission of this product is? Am I helping them get behind it? And am I using their skills the best? So I won't go into that now because it's a whole huge area, but in the worst possible case, somebody might just leave the team under whatever circumstances and they need to be replaced. So this is why you are using these planning workshop. You've got these sprint cards. You've got this whole entire process. What this means is that if you do need to get somebody else on board, they can very quickly get up to speed. They don't need to have their hand held as they sort of spend hours reading code or whatever, because everything's documented in these cards. You've got all of the history of the project listed. The repository, which I will cover later, a bit of a mysterious concept if you're not an engineer, but I will cover the repository later, links to these cards. And that way, anybody coming into the team afresh can very quickly get up to speed and feel like they're part of the team. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this free preview. Jump on over to totallyatthing.substack.com to get the rest of this content. New subscribers get a free unlock, so you don't have to stop here. Answers to your questions and some great freebies awaiting. I'll see you there.